Cafe owner kicks out elderly black woman. Unaware Mark Wahlberg is watching. The sun peered tentatively over the city skyline, bathing the gray sidewalks in a fleeting sheen of gold as commuters hurried along, each lost in private thoughts of looming deadlines or the taste of a hot morning brew that might momentarily ease the day's tension. And there, tucked amid towering office blocks and a jumble of old walk-ups, stood a modest cafe exuding a homely charm that beckoned to every passerby. Its chipped wooden sign bore the name Lambert's Coffee and Comfort, hinting at the warmth inside, though the cafe owner, Mr. Lambert, was less inclined to mirror the sign's invitation in his demeanor, preferring instead a no-nonsense approach that some considered rigid and others found reassuring. Steam curled from freshly brewed coffee pots, drifting past the large glass windows where people outside could glimpse harried baristas darting behind the counter, orchestrating a symphony of milk frothers and espresso shots while juggling a half-dozen orders at once. Regulars thronged the narrow space, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of languages, accents, and spontaneous laughter. But beneath that convivial soundtrack lay a subtle tension stemming from Mr. Lambert's insistence on punctuality, decorum, and unyielding adherence to his personal code of standards. His insistence that all cups be arranged in precise rows, that each table remain unsullied by stray sugar grains or coffee drips, and that nobody linger too long without purchasing something had become legendary among the neighborhood's inhabitants, who nonetheless returned day after day, knowing that the coffee here was somehow worth the fuss. Gray-haired writers perched by the window with laptops glowing against the morning light, typing out fledgling manuscripts or the next big article, pausing only to sip from carefully crafted cappuccinos or rummage for notebooks in worn satchels that had seen better days. A group of college students, sporting backpacks brimming with textbooks and phone chargers, huddled around a corner table, their tired smiles brightening the moment the aroma of baked croissants reached their senses, and they traded stories about professors and homework that never seemed to end. Construction workers ambled in, boots leaving dusty footprints, exchanging playful banter as they waited for strong black coffee to fuel another day of hoisting beams and hammering nails under the relentless sun, resigned to the gentle eye roll from Mr. Lambert over the grime they inevitably tracked in. Towering corporate professionals in crisp suits swept through like gusts of wind, checking the time on their expensive watches and glancing impatiently at the bustling line, convinced that every second lost in the cafe queue was a second that might compromise their carefully calibrated schedules. A few retirees, clad in comfortable sweaters and thick scarves, shared gentle conversations about grandkids and days gone by, recalling how this block had transformed from a quiet residential area to an eclectic hub of commerce and culture, complete with the endearing but stern presence of Mr. Lambert, who regarded them with a polite nod whenever he caught their eye. The overhead lighting, though still subdued, bounced off the polished floors and gleamed against the sleek espresso machines, making the space feel both intimate and lively as the hum of conversation ebbed and flowed. Twice a morning, Mr. Lambert himself would shuffle out from behind the counter to inspect the seating area, shooting swift, disapproving glances at half-finished cups or newspapers left strewn across tabletops, as though the slightest deviation from cleanliness offended his intrinsic sense of order. Patrons had learned to navigate his quiet fussiness by politely stacking their empty cups or wiping their crumbs, an unspoken ritual that fostered a strange camaraderie, a sense that they were collectively working to maintain the delicate balance he demanded. Bright overhead menus advertised various specialty beverages like cardamom lattes, chocolate mochas topped with handmade whipped cream, and a mysterious house blend rumored to keep early morning dozers wide awake well into the late afternoon. Above the clamor, the hiss and sputter of the espresso machine punctuated every moment, releasing ribbons of fragrant steam that teased the senses, making people stand a bit taller or breathe a little deeper, wanting desperately to latch onto any comfort that could be found before trudging through the rest of their day. Small talk drifted from table to table, weaving patterns of conversation about the weather, local events, work woes, and the intangible optimism that always seems to hover just on the cusp of morning routines. A stray cat occasionally peered through the window, tail flicking impatiently, only to be gently shooed away by an annoyed Mr. Lambert who muttered about health codes and fur getting into the pastry display, though some regulars couldn't resist surreptitiously slipping the cat a morsel of leftover muffin. A local busker often stood outside, strumming gentle tunes on a battered guitar, luring in passersby with warm chords, But Mr. Lambert preferred the quiet hum of his patrons to any external performance, remarking tersely that music at that hour reminded him of chaotic dinner parties he detested hosting. He was not one for conversation, rarely offering more than a brusque greeting, but the entire block respected him, acknowledging that anyone who oversaw such a bustling operation with clockwork precision must harbor a sincere devotion to the craft of coffee-making. Lines formed swiftly out the door, especially on weekdays, as word of the café's unparalleled brews spread beyond the neighborhood, leading to curious newcomers who braced themselves for what felt like an impromptu audition before Mr. Lambert's discerning gaze. The bell above the door chimed incessantly, each clang marking another arrival. Another set of footsteps that caused the wooden floorboards to creak and groan under the cumulative weight of the entire city's morning rush. Despite the cramped space and the undercurrent of hustle, there was something comforting about the routine of it all. The comforting clang of ceramic against saucer, the practiced swirl of milk in lattes, and the way the sun's rays finally invaded the interior, illuminating even the dust motes floating in midair. Baristas hustled to keep up with the constant wave of orders, calling out names that merged into a melodic chorus, though sometimes they stumbled over unusual monikers, prompting laughter from those waiting. In a corner booth, two colleagues hovered over open laptops, debating the latest trends in digital marketing, each fueled by triple-shot espressos that kept their heads bobbing with fervent energy. At the front counter, a flustered mother tried to balance a stroller in one hand and exact change in the other, while a toddler with bright, curious eyes stretched out for a small donut, mesmerized by its colorful sprinkles. The single worn-out ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, occasionally rattling as if protesting the stiff morning air that threatened to suffocate the cramped interior, yet it found no mercy from Mr. Lambert, who had little patience for mechanical quirks. Street-side diners who lingered at sidewalk tables balanced precariously close to the curb, sipping iced coffees in the chill air, forging a sense of camaraderie as they watched each passing car, each new face, as though the world was a grand stage and they were bit players in a fleeting scene. A sense of careful choreography bound them all, from the harried patrons to the exacting owner, each performing their part in the collective ballet of the early hours, whose ephemeral moments were as priceless as they were fleeting. Tall buildings loomed overhead, sealing in the bustling energy and reflecting it back in the bright, mirrored windows, while horns from distant traffic provided a soundtrack of modern chaos that seeped into every corner of the café. Inside, though, one could almost pretend that time was measured not by schedules and alarms, but by the steady rhythm of the espresso machine's metallic heartbeat and the comforting swirl of hot milk in a paper cup. Tourists sometimes stumbled across this unassuming haven, delighting in the hidden gem's cozy aura, only to be startled by the strict warning posted near the door that insisted on an order-before-seating policy, meticulously enforced by Mr. Lambert. These visitors would whisper to each other, half in awe and half in disbelief, that in a city bursting with fast-paced chaos, there existed a place where the owner's unwavering rules both protected and alienated in equal measure. Even old-timers, the ones who had watched the café's inception from a dusty corner store into a fixture of the neighborhood's identity, recognized that Mr. Lambert's stern approach ensured a certain dignity in daily life, compelling everyone to act with respect in a world that too often forgot such niceties. Though the morning air beyond those walls was thick with tension, bills to be paid, deadlines looming, and personal battles unspoken, stepping inside Lambert's for a moment offered a sensation akin to pausing time, if only to catch one's breath amidst the swirl of existence. The smell of cinnamon buns and buttered toast wafted from the kitchen, each pastry meticulously placed behind the glass display, a testament to Mr. Lambert's insistence that everything be presented just so, as though any crumb out of place would be a personal affront. Some found his narrow-eyed vigil intimidating, especially when he quietly chastised them for overstaying their welcome without ordering refills. Yet there was a grudging reverence for his devotion, for the energy he poured into fostering this buzzing environment where strangers coexisted for precious morning minutes. Occasionally, exhausted souls would wander in, beaten down by life's incessant struggles, and Mr. Lambert would merely grunt, prepare their coffee, and extend it with a firm nod, his impassive stare concealing whatever sympathy or judgment might lurk behind it. Wind occasionally tore through the door when someone slipped out, rustling scattered napkins and forcing baristas to dash around in an attempt to keep the café's order intact, under the unyielding eye of its commander. In the midst of this orchestrated mayhem, people found solace in the routine, in the predictable cadence of Mr. Lambert's demands, for it provided a semblance of stability in an otherwise ever-shifting world. An occasional frown from him, or the slight arch of his eyebrow, could discourage frivolous chatter or half-hearted manners, enforcing a standard that seemed draconian on the surface but perhaps functioned as an anchor to a kinder, more methodical era. As the morning wore on, the line ebbed and flowed, with newcomers replacing those who hustled out the door, coffee in hand, each wave of departure and arrival contributing to a cycle that had repeated daily for years, and would continue to repeat for years to come. Street vendors hawking newspapers shouted headlines that drifted in faintly whenever the bell above the door chimed, complementing the clatter of cups and the undertone of hushed conversations. Every so often, Mr. Lambert let a flicker of a smile tug at the corner of his lips if a customer praised the perfect foam or an impeccably balanced latte, but he masked such fleeting pride under a businesslike nod, never allowing himself more than a second of indulgence. Only those who frequented the café each morning knew these tiny details, the quiet language of micro-expressions and gestures through which Mr. Lambert communicated the closest thing to warmth he could muster. After all, for him, the true language of affection was in the precise measurement of coffee grounds, the swift wipe of a table to greet the next patron, and the reluctance to allow chaos to overshadow what he considered an art form. In every corner of Lambert's Coffee and Comfort, stories converged. Blossoming friendships, whispered confessions, frantic job interview preparations, and last-minute pep talks before nerve-wracking medical appointments, all woven into the hum of espresso machines and the subtle mania of a new day. Even the sturdy barstools by the counter seemed to absorb these overlapping narratives, creaking under the weight of countless passersby who found themselves momentarily anchored within those four walls, soothed by a cup of something hot and a rare flash of human connection. Despite the strict nature of Mr. Lambert's oversight, an undeniable current of warmth ran through the place, an undercurrent of possibility that one might find a friend or an unexpected kindness in the very spot that had once seemed so rigid and unwelcoming. In truth, it was a morning microcosm of city life, distilled into foam-topped mugs and fleeting pleasantries, as though the entire metropolis were condensed into that single establishment, waiting for the day to begin in earnest. By the time the clock approached 9, the café was heaving with activity, the baristas' hair plastered to their foreheads with sweat from the unrelenting demand, while Mr. Lambert glided among the customers with a practiced stride, assuring that each transaction proceeded with punctual efficiency. And so the humble café, dwarfed by surrounding skyscrapers, stood resolute as a beacon of routine, the one place where, day after day, the rest of the world's complications could be momentarily traded for the simple, unspoken hope that a good cup of coffee might lend the courage needed to face whatever awaited beyond those doors. She inched the café door open, her hands trembling from the morning's chill, but more profoundly from a nameless apprehension that had grown with every step she took along the bustling street, and the sudden rush of heated air enveloped her like an unsure embrace, almost daring her to step forward and claim her spot among the preoccupied patrons already filling the narrow aisles. The worn soles of her shoes echoed softly against the polished floor, highlighting the disparity between her presence and the carefully curated elegance of Lambert's Coffee and Comfort, where every chair was tucked in at a precise angle, every cup stacked with machine-like symmetry, and every stray crumb swept away before it could even settle. She paused near the threshold, momentarily captivated by the sweet aroma of fresh pastries mingling with the sharper scent of espresso, a wave of memory overtaking her senses and carrying her back decades, to when she would wake before dawn to knead dough in her own humble kitchen, her late husband waiting patiently at the table with a kind word or two. A hesitant smile quivered on her lips as she scanned the assembly of strangers hunched over laptops, newspapers, and half-eaten croissants, wondering if even a single person would share a welcoming nod or an encouraging glance, for she had grown unaccustomed to places so brimming with hurried souls on missions she could hardly comprehend. The morning's subtle chatter swelled and ebbed around her, forming a protective cocoon that shielded each table's occupants from truly acknowledging one another. And perhaps that was why hardly anyone seemed to notice her somewhat uncertain figure poised at the edge of their routines, as though she were a fleeting ghost passing through. Still, she clutched her worn coat tighter, its edges fraying at the cuffs, her hunched shoulders a testament to the many winters she had weathered, both literal and metaphorical. and she mustered the fragile courage to move deeper into the café, guided by the gentle pop and hiss of steam that rose from the barista's station. For a moment, the swirl of cappuccino foam and the hiss of frothing milk soothed her senses, promising warmth that went beyond mere temperature. And that subtle, nurturing promise gave her the nerve to make eye contact with one of the servers, a young woman who offered a quick, polite smile before turning back to an ever-growing list of orders. She found her gaze drifting toward a small table in the far corner, a bit out of the way, where she might set down her cumbersome bag, bulging with items that told silent stories of her life's journey, and perhaps order something simple enough to justify resting there for a few precious moments. Her heart pounded unexpectedly, as though it recognized that the unspoken rules of this place might not align with her intention to linger, and indeed, she noticed Mr. Lambert himself shooting a reserved glance in her direction, his eyes narrowing slightly, his body poised to intervene if she violated one of his well-known boundaries. She had heard rumors about this café, how its famously stern owner ran the establishment like a well-oiled machine, ensuring nobody lingered without purchasing something, and how he eyed customers who seemed aimless or overly relaxed. But she had not anticipated the intensity of his scrutiny, nor the silent disapproval radiating from the way he stood behind the counter with arms rigidly folded. A flush of discomfort warmed her cheeks, mingling shame with fatigue, yet she was determined to find a spot to rest, to gather her thoughts away from the unpredictable city streets, and so she slowly proceeded toward the table, her footsteps careful, her gaze lowered to avoid meeting Mr. Lambert's eyes. Every inch of that short distance felt magnified, as though her journey was less about crossing a tiled floor and more about defying an unspoken class of social hierarchies that had long since made themselves comfortable in countless establishments across town. The young barista snuck one more glance at her, fleeting concern flashing across her face, but it was swept away by the chorus of demands from waiting patrons, so the elderly woman found no ally in that moment, only the unrelenting hum of commerce pressing forward without pause. She finally set her bag down, exhaling softly as her spine relaxed a fraction, her aching knees grateful for the momentary reprieve from standing. Yet a prickling sense of being watched compelled her to keep her posture as dignified as possible. The seat she chose offered a partial view of the street outside, where busy pedestrians jostled in haste, briefcases in hand, coats flapping in the breeze, all living out stories she would never know, just as she was an enigma to them. For an instant, she found solace in that anonymity, that fleeting sense that maybe she could disappear into the background and sip her coffee undisturbed, free from questions about her circumstances or stares that carried assumptions. But the harsh clink of ceramic behind her jarred her out of that brief fantasy, and when she turned, she found Mr. Lambert silently observing her from a distance, his expression hard to read beyond a certain tension that curled at the corners of his mouth. Something about the way he stood, chin lifted, arms locked across his chest, conveyed both an air of authority and a certain practiced mistrust, as though he were cataloging her every movement, deciding if she might overstay, or if she might disrupt the immaculate order he guarded so fiercely. She folded her hands in her lap, fighting the urge to clear her throat or rummage through her purse, lest she appear more nervous than she already felt, all too aware that other customers had started casting fleeting looks her way, their curiosity piqued by Mr. Lambert's unmasked focus. The hum of conversation dipped for a heartbeat, only to surge again as the café's patrons resumed their personal dialogues, some dismissing the scene as just another quirk of the morning, others too lost in their own concerns to care. She tried to anchor herself by mentally recalling a recipe she'd once perfected for sweet potato pie, letting the memory of cinnamon and nutmeg fill her consciousness, steadying her breath against the rising knot of anxiety that threatened to unravel her composure. But no recollection of comforting kitchens or beloved family gatherings could fully shield her from the sharp awareness that this was not a place that welcomed wanderers or those who simply needed a rest from the unyielding press of the outside world. When she finally met Mr. Lambert's eyes, she offered a timid smile, a gesture of goodwill that she hoped might soften his stance or assure him that she was not there to cause trouble, simply a weary soul in need of a warm beverage. Yet the corners of his mouth tightened further, his voice thick with the authority of an owner who had seen too many people treat his café like a shelter rather than a business, and though he did not immediately speak, his disapproving posture spoke volumes. She swallowed hard, suddenly questioning whether she should abandon the seat and head back outside, But the brisk cold and her own exhaustion made that prospect feel insurmountable, so she remained put, mustering courage from some deep well of resilience built over many hardships. The barista approached tentatively, balancing a pen and notepad, politely asking what the elderly woman would like to order, and the question felt both merciful and urgent, for it was as if the simple act of choosing a drink would validate her presence and grant her temporary reprieve from Mr. Lambert's judgment. She ordered a small cup of coffee, her voice nearly lost amid the surrounding chatter, and though it was all she could afford, she promised herself silently that she would nurse every last drop so as not to raise suspicion about her intentions to linger. The barista nodded with practiced neutrality and retreated to the counter, where Mr. Lambert was already muttering under his breath, though she could not hear his exact words over the whir of the espresso machine and the clatter of mugs being loaded into place. When he noticed the paltry amount of money the woman handed over, his eyes flicked first to the register, then back to her, a subtle shift in expression that betrayed his doubts about her ability to pay for anything more than the bare minimum. She kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the soft wrinkles in her coat sleeve, where time had etched itself into the fabric as inexorably as it had into her life, and she wondered if she had made a mistake coming here, if she should have found another corner of the city to rest in, away from this quiet tension. Yet, the short respite granted by the sturdy café chair was more precious to her now than she could articulate, and she released a measured exhale, each breath a reminder that she still had reasons to push forward, no matter how subtle or small they seemed under the weight of prying eyes. The sound of steam abruptly halted, replaced by a brief silence that snapped her attention back toward the counter, where her modest coffee was being prepared, and she saw Mr. Lambert lean over to whisper something to the barista, who responded with a subdued nod. She worried that the exchange might foreshadow an inevitable confrontation, that perhaps she was about to be asked to move to a different seat, or worse, to take her business elsewhere, but for the moment, she tried to quiet her racing thoughts. After a handful of heartbeats, the barista carried a small cup toward the table, placing it gently before the woman without uttering a word, the thin wisp of steam curling upward like a beacon of solace, if only for a fleeting moment in a city that seldom paused for reflection. She lifted the cup with both hands, savoring the warmth against her palms, as though the gentle heat might thaw not only her cold fingers but also the wary apprehension gnawing at her spirit, and she let the first sip roll over her tongue in a modest wave of gratitude. Behind the counter, Mr. Lambert continued observing her, his expression conflicted, perhaps torn between his stringent policy of running a business and the semblance of empathy that occasionally flickered in his stance, though he masked it quickly whenever a new customer demanded his attention. She could almost sense the subtle shift in the café's atmosphere, as if a chord had been plucked that resonated uneasily among those who had noticed the silent standoff, each patron unsure whether to mind their own affairs or insert themselves into a situation that had yet to fully unfold. With cautious determination, she reached into her coat pocket and retrieved a small paper packet containing sugar, tearing it slowly and stirring the grains into her coffee, each rotation of the spoon a gentle defiance against the underlying tension in the air. Every clink of metal against ceramic rang out like a tiny declaration of independence, and she clung to the notion that she had every right to be here, to occupy a chair in a public space, to enjoy a moment of respite without feeling unworthy. Yet, a part of her could not help recalling the countless times she had been turned away, overlooked or outright dismissed in similar establishments, her age and appearance marking her as someone who might inconvenience the smooth running of a place that catered to the hustle and bustle of a younger, more affluent crowd. She cast a tentative glance around, noticing how each table was occupied by individuals chatting, typing, reading, forging connections or escaping them, and it struck her how rarely she found herself in such company these days, how seldom she indulged in a ritual as simple as ordering coffee and sitting among others. Beneath the swirl of these reflections, her mind flickered back to the bare kitchen in her cramped apartment, where the heater only worked half the time, and the idea of a hot cup of coffee in a heated café had seemed like a splendid plan, a tiny act of self-care that, for once, she dared to embrace. The hunch in her shoulders softened slightly as she tried to savor the calm, but the watchful presence of Mr. Lambert loomed over her like a tall, immovable shadow, reminding her that this was but a fragile calm, easily shattered if his patience ran out. Perhaps she should have tried to talk to him, to disarm his suspicion by sharing a friendly word or two, but the sharp lines etched on his face warned her that her efforts might not be well received, and she had grown weary of rejections. An odd hush fell over one corner of the café as another patron glanced over, perhaps noticing Mr. Lambert's unwavering stare, and the tension began to ripple outward, a faint current of concern that traveled from table to table like a silent rumor. She lifted the cup again, taking another measured sip, determined to anchor herself, to let the warmth settle in her belly like a balm against the harshness of the world, all the while trying not to think of how precarious her moment of comfort truly was. A couple of customers rose to leave, collecting coats and bags, weaving through the tables until they reached the door, which chimed anew as they departed, letting a gust of winter air blast inside, snapping the elderly woman out of her introspective state. She forced a gentle smile at their retreating forms, a polite habit she had learned long ago, to acknowledge people's exits in the hope that warmth might be reciprocated in future encounters. But they were already gone, lost in their own morning narratives. Just then, Mr. Lambert stepped forward, an unmistakable purpose in his stride, his hands no longer folded but swaying at his sides as though gearing up for a definitive action, and her heartbeat quickened in response. She glanced down at her coffee, half-finished, the swirl of sugar no longer visible, and gripped the handle tighter, uncertain of what she might say or do if he demanded she leave or ask her more pointedly about her intentions. The question of whether she truly belonged here pressed at the back of her mind, a nagging, uncomfortable truth that places like this, despite appearances, were not always meant for her, not when the unwritten rules favored those who could afford more than a single small coffee and a brief moment of rest. Still, some part of her refused to relinquish the simple pleasure of enjoying a hot drink on a cold morning, some primal defiance that whispered she had a right to be here just as much as anyone else, no matter how meager her funds or how frayed her clothing. She breathed in slowly, the bittersweet fragrance of coffee filling her lungs and fortifying her resolve. Even as Mr. Lambert drew nearer, his expression taut, like a guardian at the threshold of his kingdom, uncertain whether to permit her continued stay within his domain. A hush seemed to spread across the adjacent tables as he came to stand a few paces from her, and though she willed herself to meet his stare with calm dignity, her eyes betrayed a flicker of weariness, a reflection of a lifetime spent grappling with unspoken barriers. In that tense instant, the café's identity seemed to hinge upon this unassuming table and its occupant, revealing the raw underbelly of what it meant to be set apart in a world that prided itself on convenience and efficiency, on meeting the demands of consumers who rarely questioned the boundaries they themselves did not face. She inhaled one more time, bracing herself for what was to come, feeling the weight of unvoiced accusations, the palpable distrust lurking behind Mr. Lambert's silence, and she wondered if a single gesture of compassion from him might defuse the storm clouds gathering in the corners of her mind. Yet, compassion was a tricky commodity in a place defined by strict routines and unwavering expectations, and as the elderly woman lifted her eyes to meet his, she could almost read the unspoken tension that roiled in his stance, a prelude to the conflict that was about to unfold. A hush fell over the immediate vicinity of her small table the moment Mr. Lambert approached, his usually measured stride replaced by clipped, urgent steps that caused patrons nearby to pause mid-sentence and glance nervously at one another, as though anticipating a scene they had all hoped would never unfold in such a place. He stopped just a foot away from her, arms folded across his chest, and though he uttered no greeting, his pursed lips and narrowed eyes spoke volumes, conveying a stern disapproval that prickled the air like static electricity before a storm. She raised her gaze from the half-finished cup of coffee on the scratched tabletop, her heart already pounding from the silent hostility emanating from him, and tried to muster a polite smile, but it came out strained and uncertain, like a plea for understanding in a land not known for its generosity. The café, once a cacophony of steaming milk, clinking cups, and overlapping conversation, seemed to hold its breath as Mr. Lambert cleared his throat, the sound slicing through the tension like a razor and causing the elderly woman to straighten her back, gripping her coat with trembling fingers. He asked, in a cold, clipped voice that belied any veneer of customer service, whether she planned to order anything else, his words exposing the underlying suspicion that she might be there merely to escape the day's chill without paying her fair share. She swallowed hard, hearing the faintest tremor in her own voice as she softly explained that all she could afford was the small coffee she had in front of her, that she was only looking for a brief respite, a single moment of warmth before carrying on with her difficult morning. His brow knotted in response, and a flicker of frustration glimmered in his eyes, as if the mere hint of human need was an affront to the meticulous operation he prided himself on running without disruptions or inconveniences. She could feel the attention of every patron in that café now resting squarely on the two of them, creating a solemn circle of witnesses who watched with growing discomfort as he leaned in closer and informed her, voice taut, that he could not allow people to linger for too long without making additional purchases, that loitering was against café policy, and that she was occupying a table which other, presumably more profitable customers might soon require. A mixture of shame and indignation caused a flush to creep across her cheeks, and she tried to defend herself with quiet dignity, pointing out that the café was not at full capacity, that she was not disturbing anyone, that she had, in fact, purchased a drink and deserved at least the courtesy of finishing it. Mr. Lambert, however, was unmoved, and the sternness in his gaze only hardened, lips thinning as he curtly shot back that the rules applied to everyone, that there would be chaos if he made exceptions, and that he had observed people in the past who took advantage of his establishment by lingering for hours without spending more than a few spare coins. She opened her mouth to speak again but found her voice caught in her throat, the unrelenting coldness of his stance dredging up a lifetime of similar experiences, all of them swirling together to form a knot of despair in her chest, and for a moment, she feared she might begin to weep right then and there. One of the baristas, a young woman with compassionate eyes, glanced over from behind the espresso machine, looking torn, as though wanting to intervene but bound by the knowledge that Mr. Lambert's word in the café was final, that any objection might jeopardize her own position. A handful of customers exchanged grim looks, their mouths set in uneasy lines, some softly whispering to companions that this seemed excessive, that the elderly woman was hardly a nuisance, while others remained silent, sipping their coffee to avoid being drawn into the confrontation. Tension crackled in the air, intensifying with each second that the owner loomed over his unwelcome guest, whose shaky breath began to form halting words of apology and regret, an instinctive reaction born from countless encounters where she had been made to feel like an intruder rather than a patron. Mr. Lambert shook his head, dismissing her timid attempts at explanation with a flick of his hand, his frustration rising to the surface as he told her that if she could not purchase more, she was required to leave immediately, that his establishment was not a shelter, and that he would not compromise on principle. The elderly woman could hear her heart thundering in her ears, and when she tried to stand, her knees nearly buckled under the weight of humiliation, forcing her to cling to the edge of the table for balance, all the while wishing fervently that she could dissolve into the air. Another patron, who looked to be in his mid-30s, cleared his throat and ventured a hesitant protest, remarking that there seemed to be no harm in allowing her to finish her coffee in peace. But Mr. Lambert shot him a stern glare, sharply reminding him that this was a private business and that nobody had the right to dictate its policies. A tremor coursed through her frail frame as she managed to regain her footing, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, and her throat constricted with the overpowering sense that once again, she was being pushed out of a space she had hoped would offer momentary solace. She reached for her coat, the battered fabric seeming to symbolize how tattered she felt inside, while overhead, the café lights shone mercilessly, illuminating the lines of sorrow etched across her weary face. The hush that had descended on the café took on an even heavier quality, as though every observer's conscience was pinned beneath the stark image of an elderly woman being forced out. Yet Mr. Lambert seemed unshakable in his decision, his posture radiating a righteous conviction that he was simply following established rules. She bowed her head, gathering her meager belongings into her arms, but something in the pit of her stomach pleaded for her to at least look him in the eyes, to see if any compassion lingered behind that polished facade, and so she mustered the courage to meet his stare. The moment their eyes locked, he pressed his lips into a tighter line, reaffirming his stance with a single, curt nod that confirmed she had overstayed her welcome, that it was time for her to leave without further delay. Her lips parted to form one last statement, perhaps an apology or a dignified challenge, but she found she lacked the breath or resolve for either, so she only dipped her head again, accepting this fate with a resignation that spoke to an entire lifetime of being shuffled aside. As she took her first step away from the table, the clatter of her coffee cup tumbling against the saucer startled her, the sound echoing like a final, discordant note in a dreadful symphony, and she hurried to steady it before it could shatter. A couple near the corner exchanged troubled glances, one leaning over to the other in a hushed tone about how unnecessary this spectacle was, while across the room a man in a business suit closed his laptop and stood, evidently uncomfortable with bearing witness to such an ugly display. Mr. Lambert moved slightly aside, leaving just enough space for her to maneuver past him without physical contact. And the arrangement felt like the parting of a barrier, a forced funnel through which she had no choice but to exit. Her gaze flickered to the door, that old bell ready to chime the moment she crossed the threshold, and never had a sound felt so charged with defeat, its inevitable ring already echoing in her mind as she pictured herself back on the cold street with nowhere better to go. Each shuffle of her feet was accompanied by the rustle of her coat, a whispering testament to her gradual retreat from the café's warm interior, while Mr. Lambert stood unyielding, that same dispassionate expression turning her departure into a show of his unwavering authority. More than once, she heard a faint murmur of support from someone braver or more upset by what was happening. But no single voice rose loud enough to halt the process, and in that moment, the act of communal witnessing only amplified her loneliness. The aroma of coffee and pastries, once so inviting, now felt suffocatingly heavy, mingling with the stale odor of hostility that clung to the air, reminding her that sweetness and bitterness often coexisted in the strangest ways. As she neared the exit, the curious eyes of the street peered in, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside, and a low rumble of traffic droned on, indifferent to her plight and the moral quandaries stirring within the onlookers. One of the baristas pretended to busy herself wiping down the espresso machine, though her hands shook with an emotion she struggled to contain, and when she finally dared to turn around, her expression was pained, holding a kind of helplessness that mirrored the dissatisfaction rippling through several patrons. The elderly woman slid her fingers into the pocket of her coat to check if any coins remained, some desperate, last-minute thought about maybe ordering a refill to appease the owner. But all she found was a receipt from another day, worthless in the face of the present crisis. She sighed, a broken exhalation of sorrow, and reminded herself that she had survived worse than this, that the cruelty of strangers was nothing new, though it never ceased to wound her in ways she could hardly describe, each instance like a fresh cut layered over half-healed scars. Mr. Lambert, evidently concluding that the matter was nearly resolved, took a step back, crossing his arms again with a finality that suggested any further protest would be futile, and the hush that filled the café felt like the aftermath of some formal decree. She clutched the strap of her bag as though it were a lifeline, each ragged breath reminding her that, though she was leaving with the same burdens she'd arrived with, at least she would do so with her dignity intact, or what remained of it after this public spectacle. Glancing at the floor, she watched the reflection of overhead lights skitter across her worn shoes, took one last look at the table where her coffee sat untouched and cooling, then reached for the door, pushing it open with a gentle push that belied the storm roiling beneath her calm exterior. The bell gave a sharp, metallic jingle that resonated through the room, seeming to punctuate the moment with an accusatory clang that echoed the unspoken disapproval swirling in the silence, and the cold breeze of the street rushed in, snuffing out what little warmth she might have gathered. Mr. Lambert's eyes trailed her until she vanished from sight, then he pivoted slowly, scanning the faces of his customers as though daring any of them to challenge him, his posture rigid and unrepentant, claiming the moral high ground of someone who believed he had only done what was necessary to preserve his business. A few patrons turned away, muttering under their breath, while others glared openly, appalled by the heartlessness of the exchange they had just witnessed, and the young barista paused her cleaning to blink away the moisture gathering in her eyes. The tension that remained was thick enough to stifle any immediate return to normalcy, and for a fleeting moment, the café seemed to exist in a twilight of collective shame, with Mr. Lambert standing defiantly at its center, unbowed but not unscathed by the moral weight of his actions. Outside, the elderly woman paused on the sidewalk to catch her breath, shoulders drooping, her eyes stinging from a mixture of the biting wind and the humiliation she had just endured, while the city continued to churn around her, indifferent to the personal tragedies contained within its infinite bustle. She glanced once more at the café sign overhead, a bitter realization settling in that sometimes the promise of comfort meant nothing if it came with unspoken conditions and unyielding demands, and she silently vowed never to darken that doorway again, no matter the chill or the ache in her bones. As she drifted away into the crowded pavement, her silhouette growing smaller with each step, inside the café, an almost suffocating quiet still lingered, the patrons caught in the aftershock of bearing witness to a moral rift far greater than the sum of its outward details. Mr. Lambert exhaled, finally breaking the silence by urging the baristas to get back to work. His tone dismissive and brisk, as if by resuming ordinary tasks, they might collectively erase the memory of this unpleasant scene. Yet, the remainder of that morning was steeped in an unspoken tension, as though the collective conscience of those present bore a bruise that would not heal easily, and a few people quietly collected their belongings and left, unwilling to sip coffee under a roof that demanded the eviction of an elderly woman who had only sought a small measure of warmth. The café lights gleamed on the freshly wiped tables and the shining espresso machines as usual, but the atmosphere had changed in a subtle, irrevocable way that not even the swirl of milk froth or the aroma of freshly baked muffins could entirely mask. And so, with the door still gently clanging from time to time, the city's swirling currents of humanity continued to ebb and flow around the place, but the memory of that eviction lingered like a dark stain on what had once been a seemingly ordinary morning routine, as if reminding each person that sometimes cruelty requires no words beyond a simple order to leave. An unremarkable figure near the corner of the café, clad in a discreet baseball cap pulled low over his forehead and sporting a nondescript jacket that helped him blend seamlessly with the steady rush of city dwellers, sat nursing a latte that he never once appeared to sip, instead keeping his gaze fixed on the unfolding drama with quietly contained tension that few others noticed until far too late. He had arrived earlier that morning, weaving his way through the throng of commuters and tourists, taking a seat by the window to observe a neighborhood he had not visited in some time, but which stirred a nostalgia he rarely had the freedom to indulge, given the constant demands of his public persona. Even in this relatively unassuming setting, he knew his face was too recognizable to risk open exposure, so he kept his features angled away from the direct light and concealed beneath his cap, carefully avoiding eye contact with the busy baristas while tracking each mundane yet telling detail of Lambert's rigid café routines. The tension in the room heightened when Mr. Lambert first confronted the elderly woman, and though many patrons turned away or feigned disinterest, this mysterious observer watched every word, every subtle shift in the owner's expression, absorbing the scene with an air of contained dismay that contrasted with his otherwise calm demeanor. He sensed the arc of injustice as if it were a palpable weight in the air, intensifying with every moment that Mr. Lambert's voice sharpened, and by the time she was cruelly ushered out the door, he found himself gripping the edge of his cup so hard it nearly cracked under the strain of his frustration. The quiet that followed her departure unsettled him deeply, so he remained seated for a few more minutes, scanning the room to gauge the reactions of the remaining patrons, searching for any sign that someone else might confront the owner, only to realize that no one seemed prepared to challenge the man who had so brazenly humiliated a defenseless woman. At length, he exhaled, took off his cap just enough to rake a hand through his hair, and gently set down his latte, steeling himself to do what no one else was apparently willing to: show the café owner that not everyone would stand idly by in the face of such blatant mistreatment. Though he prided himself on maintaining a low profile when out in public to avoid drawing crowds or paparazzi, the gravity of this moment compelled him to abandon anonymity, to leverage a measure of the influence his celebrity status afforded, with hopes of righting an obvious wrong. He slid his cap onto the table, folded the collar of his jacket back, and lifted himself from the chair with a purposeful stance, forging a path through the narrow rows of tables until he stood just a few feet away from Mr. Lambert, who regarded this approaching stranger with cautious curiosity tinged by residual irritation. His voice, when he first spoke, was soft yet unwavering, laced with anger barely tempered by an instinct for diplomacy, and he asked Mr. Lambert if the café prided itself on humiliating its most vulnerable customers or if this morning's spectacle had been some grim anomaly. Mr. Lambert, unaccustomed to challenges of this nature in his domain, stiffened and demanded to know who exactly was questioning his business practices, implicitly warning that such inquiries were unwelcome unless accompanied by substantial purchases or some vested interest in the café's operation. With a slow, deliberate motion, the man tugged the brim of his hat lower again, but this time lifted his head so the sunlight from the windows revealed a face that countless moviegoers recognized. A face rarely hidden behind a cap, one that bore the hallmark intensity of countless cinematic roles. It was Mark Wahlberg. The moment recognition began to dawn on a few of the patrons, a wave of murmurs rippled across the room, some whispering his name in hushed excitement, others gaping in disbelief that a Hollywood A-lister would appear in such an unremarkable part of town, let alone wade into a tense altercation with the café's notoriously fastidious owner. Mr. Lambert's eyes widened in surprise, though he quickly masked the initial shock with an attempt to retain composure, clearing his throat and trying to speak. But Mark seized the moment, pressing forward with a pointed question about whether that elderly woman had indeed purchased a coffee, and if so, why she had been evicted before finishing it. The cafe owner, momentarily flustered, stammered about business rules, time limits, and how the woman looked like she might have been loitering without intentions to spend further money. But these justifications rang hollow under the scrutiny of Mark's fervent glare, which held the righteous indignation of someone who had clearly seen through the shallow excuses. Mark raised his voice slightly, no longer concerned with maintaining any semblance of discretion, and demanded to know what deeper motive could compel a person to treat another human being so harshly, especially someone elderly and in obvious need of a simple kindness, his words resonating with a raw authenticity that cut through the thick tension. A wave of silence fell over the spectators as he continued, pointing out that the cafe was more than half empty, which shattered the owner's defense about needing the table for other customers, adding that his approach betrayed an ugly prejudice for which there could be no valid defense. Mr. Lambert, sensing the eyes of the entire room upon him and the imminent threat that this confrontation might tarnish his reputation, snapped back that he would not be lectured in his own establishment, but his voice faltered under the weight of Mark's resolute, unyielding stare. A petite woman in a smart business suit, seated at a nearby table, decided to speak up at last, hesitantly confirming that she too had witnessed the confrontation with the elderly patron, and though she had done nothing to stop it, she admitted it was unfair and left her feeling deeply uncomfortable. Another man chimed in, shame coloring his words, expressing regret for not intervening sooner, while around the room, scattered nods signaled a collective remorse that was slowly bubbling to the surface now that someone influential had finally forced the conversation into the open. Mark turned his gaze from one speaker to the next, acknowledging their testimonials with a curt nod, then refocused on Mr. Lambert, reminding him, in clear, almost chillingly calm terms, that businesses are built on the trust and goodwill of the community they serve, and that driving away a vulnerable person in such a humiliating manner only revealed the rotten underbelly of misguided prejudice. Visibly rattled, Mr. Lambert fumbled for a rebuttal, muttering something about how he didn't see her as vulnerable, that she simply seemed like a potential liability or someone who might linger and cause trouble. But this only drew a stern condemnation from Mark, who questioned whether the owner's biases might be rooted in the woman's appearance, her age, or even her race. The mention of race sent a ripple of unease through the crowd, for it was a topic often avoided in polite company. But in this moment, the discomfort was overshadowed by the raw truth that prejudice can manifest in small but profoundly cruel actions that speak louder than any protestations of innocence. Mark took a step closer, unafraid to stand face to face with Mr. Lambert, and said that if the owner truly believed his policy was fair and not tinged by any discrimination, then he should have extended the same treatment to every busy professional who comes in to use the Wi-Fi without ordering more than a single espresso, or to every bookish student who sits for hours writing papers while nursing a single latte. The cafe owner flinched at this pointed comment, his face reddening, and for a moment he looked as though he might forcibly eject Mark Wahlberg as well, but the presence of so many gawking onlookers, cameras peeking out from phone cases, and the knowledge that this was a beloved actor with considerable sway, forced him to temper his reaction. Mark pressed further, asserting that the real mark of a successful establishment wasn't in how quickly one can turn tables or how strictly one can enforce petty rules, but in the respect and dignity offered to each patron, especially those whose circumstances placed them in the margins of society. A hush lingered in the air between them, thick with unresolved tension, until, at last, Mr. Lambert attempted to justify himself by pointing out that the woman had been rude or refused to engage in polite dialogue, but when pressed, he struggled to recall a single instance of her rudeness, finally admitting she had simply come in quietly and asked for a place to sit. Mark's expression hardened at that confession, and he declared that the cafe owner's actions illustrated a moral failing, a willingness to disregard someone's humanity based solely on superficial judgments, and that his behavior had now tarnished his establishment's reputation far more than allowing an elderly woman to finish her coffee ever could. The crowd watching these unfolding events grew bolder, a few offering words of support to Mark, some even applauding lightly as he spoke about compassion, equality, and the inherent responsibility of those in service-oriented businesses to treat all customers with the same measure of respect. In the corner, one patron discreetly filmed the exchange on a smartphone, capturing the heated confrontation, while others sent hurried texts or posted on social media about the bizarre but satisfying spectacle of a major celebrity holding a local cafe owner accountable. Mr. Lambert's jaw clenched at the sight of the recording, realizing the potential fallout and how swiftly word can travel in a digital age, forcing him to confront the possibility that his moment of cruelty might soon become viral condemnation. Mark's voice lowered in volume, but not in intensity, as he pointed out that second chances are crucial, that while this scene could indeed ruin Lambert's business, there remained the option to acknowledge wrongdoing, apologize sincerely, and work to rectify the harm done to that elderly woman. Mr. Lambert glanced away, seemingly trapped between stubborn pride and a dawning realization that ignoring Mark's counsel, delivered in front of so many onlookers, might seal his fate in the court of public opinion, which can be far harsher and swifter than any business regulation. The actor took one more step forward, extending a gentle but firm suggestion that Mr. Lambert look inward, ask himself if this is truly the legacy he wants for his cafe, and consider whether refusing kindness to those in need is worth the potential praise of a strictly enforced policy. A murmur of agreement passed through the patrons, and several nodded, as though validating Mark's words, their earlier silence replaced by a collective desire to see genuine accountability, to witness something good come from the ugliness they had observed. Caught between the shame of his actions and the mounting pressure from the small crowd, Mr. Lambert finally sighed, acknowledging that perhaps he had acted too hastily, though the words tasted like acid on his tongue, and he visibly struggled to reconcile his own sense of order with the moral imperative that had just been spelled out for him. Mark answered with a measured nod, stating that it was not too late to make amends, urging him to find the elderly woman, offer a genuine apology, and learn from the experience before such prejudice hardened into a permanent stain on his life and his livelihood. By now, several customers had their phones out, some capturing the dialogue, others texting or tweeting the moment, and the city beyond those windows, blissfully unaware of what was happening just hours before, was about to receive an influx of updates telling the dramatic story of how a movie star had championed an elderly stranger in a modest urban cafe. Pressed under the weight of potential scandal and the heartfelt words that Mark spoke, Mr. Lambert wiped a nervous hand across his brow, murmuring an admission that he might have done wrong, though he still clung stubbornly to a vague sense of justification that the woman did not seem like a paying customer likely to stay profitable for the cafe. Mark reminded him that compassion and fairness must not hinge solely on profit, that businesses centered on genuine service often thrive precisely because they welcome all who cross their threshold with generosity, building a reputation that transcends mere financial transaction. Another hush took hold as he concluded his impassioned plea, and even those who had initially been starstruck found themselves drawn to the moral resonance of his words, impressed by the gravity with which he delivered them and the earnestness underscoring every syllable. In the wake of that pregnant silence, the cafe's environment felt utterly transformed, no longer a busy morning pit stop but rather the site of a pivotal reckoning, where each individual realized how easy it is to let prejudice go unchecked until it explodes into cruelty. Mr. Lambert stood there, brow furrowed, grappling with the knowledge that this confrontation could become tomorrow's headline, yet also perhaps offer a chance for redemption, a hinge moment that might lead him away from the path he had so rigidly followed. Mark Wahlberg, still faintly recognizable despite his attempt at anonymity, maintained his unwavering posture, ready to face whatever final words the cafe owner might have, unwilling to back down or let the moment pass without a definitive shift in perspective. Eventually, Mr. Lambert opened his mouth, the beginnings of an apology forming on his lips, though it stuttered and caught in his throat, and he managed only a strained acknowledgement that Mark's grievances had merit before turning away to stare at the door through which the elderly woman had disappeared. The actor, sensing a tenuous but meaningful shift in the owner's demeanor, exhaled slowly, offering a succinct directive that if Mr. Lambert truly wanted to salvage any shred of decency, the first step was finding the woman he had so mercilessly expelled and showing her a genuine act of contrition. The tension loosened its grip on the cafe patrons, and several people exchanged relieved glances, though many kept their phones at the ready, unsure whether this moment of introspection would be fleeting or if it would evolve into a more meaningful transformation for the man who had ruled this space with an iron fist. Mark's final words, spoken just loud enough for those closest to hear, reminded Mr. Lambert that businesses, like people, are remembered for how they treat the most vulnerable among them, and that no reputation, no matter how carefully curated, can outshine the genuine display of compassion. The moment word spread that Mark Wahlberg had publicly confronted Mr. Lambert for ejecting the elderly woman, the cafe owner felt as though the ground beneath him had split open, threatening to swallow everything he had spent years building, and he found himself teetering on the edge of a reputation crisis that left him anxious and strangely self-reflective. Inside his establishment, customers who had once lined up with silent resignation now eyed him warily, whispering among themselves about whether he truly harbored bigoted tendencies or if the whole fiasco could be dismissed as a regrettable misunderstanding. But either way, doubt burrowed deeply into the cafe's carefully curated image. Each time the bell jingled overhead, heralding the arrival of a new patron, Mr. Lambert steeled himself for yet another question about the incident, for more pointed inquiries regarding his motives, or for disapproving stares that withered his usual stern composure. In the days that followed, several of the regulars who used to greet him with a polite nod began to avoid his gaze entirely, and a handful stopped coming altogether, as though hoping to distance themselves from the moral taint now attached to the cafe's name. Social media only amplified the scandal, with brief smartphone recordings of Mark Wahlberg's confrontation circulating online, accompanied by outraged commentary demanding justice for the elderly woman, whose identity remained unknown, and suggestions that the cafe be boycotted until real accountability was shown. The phone behind the counter rang incessantly, but rather than the usual customer inquiries about hours of operation or menu items, it brought a deluge of harsh complaints, some from strangers calling from other parts of the country, venting their fury at the prejudice they believed they had witnessed. Mr. Lambert, already shaken by the humiliation of being put on the spot by a celebrity, now found himself inundated with condemnation from every corner of the digital world, with user reviews plummeting as phrases like racist treatment, elderly neglect, and cruelty to vulnerable persons peppered newly posted one-star ratings. Though he initially tried to brush off these sentiments by telling himself that the online world was prone to exaggeration, he could not ignore how quiet his cafe became during what should have been peak morning rush, or how the few that did walk in often left awkwardly after scanning the subdued atmosphere. Baristas, too, seemed uneasy in his presence, performing their duties with more robotic precision than usual, exchanging whispered comments about whether management would address the situation directly, but he kept silent, uncertain of how to even begin repairing his shattered image. If he stepped onto the sidewalk for a moment's air, passersby would sometimes recognize him, scowling or muttering insults under their breath, and once, a teenager filming a vlog approached and asked pointedly why he thought it acceptable to kick out an elderly black woman who had paid for her coffee, leaving him flustered and speechless on the curb. Returning inside felt no better, for the walls that had once protected him now seemed to magnify his guilt, reflecting it back in the haunted glances of patrons who stayed merely out of habit, clinging to a routine as fragile as his own sense of self. Late at night, alone in his small upstairs office, he wrestled with memories of the confrontation, replaying the sharp words Mark Wahlberg had thrown at him like stinging darts, recalling how he had tried to defend his actions with flimsy excuses about cafe policy and time limits. For years, he had prided himself on running a tight ship, believing that order and discipline were the keys to a successful enterprise in a city saturated with coffee shops. But now, confronted by the possibility that his strict rules might mask uglier biases, he felt an unwelcome stirring of self-doubt. Even so, some stubborn part of him clung to the idea that he had done nothing wrong except enforce boundaries, that the elderly woman would have loitered indefinitely, possibly scaring off other customers if he had allowed her to linger without further purchases. Yet each time he closed his eyes, he saw her trembling hands, the way her faded coat and the timid, apologetic lines in her expression spoke of hardship, and he recalled the simple heartbreak etched into her face when he had demanded she leave, as though she were a stray being shooed away from a doorstep. His conscience, once so confidently aligned with the principle of business efficiency, now churned in uncomfortable conflict, and he discovered he could not easily silence the part of himself that questioned if prejudice and fear had driven him to single her out more aggressively than he would have a younger, better-dressed patron. On the 5th day after the incident, a local news crew ventured into the cafe with bright lights and a camera operator, surprising Mr. Lambert mid-shift to request a statement regarding the allegations swirling online. And as they pressed him with pointed questions, he felt the room spin with the weight of mounting pressure. Anger, shame, and a fierce desire for self-preservation warred within him, and he nearly stormed out of the interview, but some glimmer of desperation to salvage his livelihood kept him rooted to the spot, stammering out half measures of regret while the camera recorded every bead of sweat on his brow. The baristas, caught in the crossfire, continued working, though their eyes flicked repeatedly to the news crew, a silent testament to the harrowing shift in atmosphere that had befouled the café's once lively hum into a tense hush, broken only by the hiss of the espresso machine. By the time the news team departed, Mr. Lambert felt drained, having offered only vague remarks about how the situation was misunderstood, and how he'd been trying to maintain fairness. But he knew, deep down, that these words would ring hollow to any who had witnessed the scene or watched Mark Wahlberg's admonition online. Social media exploded anew after the news clip aired, with critics lambasting the cafe owner's cowardly half-apology, some even remarking that his refusal to name or fine the elderly woman revealed an unwillingness to provide real restitution for the harm done. A growing crowd of protesters began organizing outside the cafe, holding signs that read "Coffee for All" and "No Room for Racism," chanting at passersby to support local businesses that treated people with dignity, urging them to avoid Lambert's until the owner proved himself worthy of their patronage. Across town, a few smaller cafes used the uproar as an opportunity to remind customers that their own doors were open to everyone, issuing statements of solidarity with the woman and with the broader principle of kindness that they believed had been cast aside in the scandal. Rumors spread that the elderly woman, who was known to frequent certain social service centers in the neighborhood, had gone into hiding or was too humiliated to come forward, and in between dealing with plummeting sales and furious phone calls, Mr. Lambert found himself haunted by the need to locate her, if only to offer the apology he had withheld for so long. Yet his attempts to discreetly gather information proved difficult, for many in the community believed he had only begun searching for her out of fear of a lawsuit or a deeper media backlash, casting doubt on his sincerity. He grew increasingly isolated in his own establishment, pacing behind the counter with restless energy, scanning the dwindling line of customers for any sign of her, flinching whenever the bell announced a new arrival, only to see another face he did not recognize or a local reporter on the hunt for fresh angles to the story. One morning, he discovered crude graffiti sprayed on the back wall near the dumpsters, labeling him a bigot in bold letters, an accusation that pounded in his chest with each step he took, forcing him to confront the raw ugliness that many believed lay at the heart of his actions. Though a twinge of indignation flared inside him, he realized that painting over the graffiti would not erase the sentiment, that if he wanted people to see him differently, he had to change from within, not just repaint the walls of his cafe. Spurred by a desperate recognition that his livelihood might be unsalvageable unless he admitted his role in this fiasco and truly repented, he finally released an official statement online, one in which he acknowledged the anger of the community, but it was buried under the flood of negative reviews and outraged posts that continued to grow each hour. Some nights, he gazed at the neatly lined cups in the darkened cafe, recalling a time when his biggest concern was whether his staff adhered to his rigid organization rules, and it stunned him to see how trivial those worries now seemed compared to the deeper moral battle he faced. The baristas, weary of the constant tension and the steady drop in tip earnings, murmured among themselves that they might soon look for work elsewhere, fearing that the café's reputation had been damaged beyond repair, and Mr. Lambert sensed their exodus would be the final nail in the coffin if he failed to act decisively. A swirl of regret churned in him each morning when he woke to fresh accusations online, rehashing the scene with the elderly woman, sometimes embellished with rumors that she had not even managed a single sip of her coffee before being expelled, a detail that tore at what remained of his self-respect. In a few fleeting moments of honest introspection, he wondered if Mark Wahlberg's confrontation had been a blessing in disguise, a jarring wake-up call that exposed the cruelty beneath his polished veneer, though the cost of this lesson felt almost unbearable. He forced himself to re-watch the various clips, wincing at the shrill note of callousness in his own voice, seeing a reflection of himself he barely recognized, a harsh figure unyielding in the face of someone's quiet, desperate plea for warmth. While some die-hard supporters argued that he had every right to manage his cafe as he saw fit, the overwhelming tide of public opinion labeled him a pariah, an embodiment of discriminatory attitudes lurking in plain sight, and these mounting critiques suffocated any lingering defiance within him. Debates even broke out on local radio talk shows, with hosts discussing whether Mr. Lambert's predicament was a symptom of a broader societal tendency to devalue the elderly and ignore the systemic inequities shaping who belongs in public spaces, adding layers of complexity he had never considered before. Every time he stumbled across these conversations, or heard them mentioned by glancing patrons, he felt another sting of guilt, realizing that his behavior had ignited a much larger cultural dialogue, and though it mortified him, he could not deny that he was at the center of a necessary reckoning. One dusk-colored evening, after closing the café early to avoid confrontations with protesters, he sat alone at a corner table, the same corner where the elderly woman had tried to rest, remembering the raw fear in her eyes as she scrambled to collect her belongings under his cold gaze. The recollection triggered a painful jolt in his chest, and he found himself whispering half-formed apologies into the empty room, haunted by the knowledge that until he found her, every word of remorse he uttered would feel hollow and self-serving. By week's end, the café's revenue had plummeted so drastically that for the first time in years, he found himself dipping into his personal savings to cover expenses, and a somber hush hung over the place, where once the hiss of steaming milk and the casual banter of customers had filled every crevice. A petition surfaced online, demanding he temporarily step away from the business and hire a manager who would retrain the staff with an emphasis on cultural sensitivity and compassion, though many signatories doubted he would heed such calls. Meanwhile, the local press followed every development, filing stories about the café's decline, sending photographers to capture images of the sparse seating areas and the forlorn expression on the café owner's face whenever he glanced at the front door. He tried not to blame Mark Wahlberg for the chaos that had overtaken his life, recognizing that, after all, the actor had only done what everyone else in that room had been too afraid to do, and if anything, the memory of his impassioned words replayed like an echo of conscience that refused to let Mr. Lambert revert to willful ignorance. A part of him began to admire the raw honesty with which Mark had spoken, the sense of moral clarity that had ignited in the actor's eyes, and he realized that he lacked that same clarity in his own heart, that for too long he had measured people by what he deemed acceptable or profitable. As the community's clamor for a genuine, personal apology to the elderly woman grew louder, he experienced a glimmer of genuine remorse that burned away layers of defensiveness, leaving behind the uncomfortable awareness that an apology might not be enough to undo the emotional damage he had inflicted. At last, on a stormy Thursday afternoon, he posted a desperate plea on social media, admitting that he had wronged the woman, calling on anyone who knew her to contact him so he could offer a real apology, not just a press release, in hopes that face-to-face contrition might bring some measure of closure. While the public was divided on whether his actions were sincerely motivated or driven by the threat of financial ruin, the very fact that he was reaching out indicated a break in his once unyielding pride, a crack through which something resembling humility might finally emerge. Yet each morning brought a fresh wave of worry, for the empty tables in his café signaled a kind of purgatory, and each hour he remained uncertain as to whether the community would ever again trust him or see him as anything but the man who had denied a frail, elderly woman her dignity. Then, late one night, as he scrolled through endless comments on his statement, some supportive, most condemning, he glimpsed a clue from someone claiming to know the elderly woman's name and whereabouts, sparking a surge of restless determination in him that he could not quell until he verified the information's accuracy. With trembling hands, he messaged them privately, beginning a conversation that, if fruitful, would lead him one step closer to the redemption he yearned for, though he carried the suffocating doubt that perhaps she would refuse to see him at all, and might even prefer he stay away forever. In that moment, a violent clash of hope and regret roiled within his mind, an internal tempest that mirrored the rumble of thunder outside, and he realized that no matter the outcome, he had reached a point of no return, where the path behind him was burned by his own actions and the only way forward lay in confronting the very prejudice he had so long denied. The following week, under a pale dawn sky that bled faint pink over the silent, concrete sprawl of the city, Mr. Lambert finally found himself nervously standing on the worn stoop of a modest community center, the address confirmed through a tenuous lead he had discovered online, and as he knocked on the metal door, the echoes of his own anxiety reverberated against chipped paint and broken streetlights. He had arrived an hour before the center officially opened, compelled by the gnawing sense that if he did not seize this moment to reconcile with the woman whose dignity he had trampled, he might well retreat into the shell of his ruined reputation and lose any remaining chance at redemption. The stout social worker who answered regarded him warily, apparently recognizing him from the recent media storm, and asked with a pointed skepticism in her voice why he had shown up unannounced in search of one of the center's regular visitors. She neither scowled nor smiled, but her direct gaze carried the weight of countless hardships she had helped others weather, and, reluctantly, he explained that he needed to speak with the elderly woman. Her name revealed to be Mrs. Adelaide Freeman. In order to deliver a personal apology, not just a hollow corporate statement or a half-measure spurred by fear of financial ruin. The social worker studied him for a tense moment, clearly sizing up whether his presence masked ulterior motives, then stepped aside, instructing him to wait in the hallway until Miss Freeman arrived for her weekly craft group meeting. By the time she did appear, her back slightly stooped, a thick sweater draped over her slender shoulders. The sun had climbed higher, illuminating motes of dust drifting through the center's fluorescent-lit corridors, and her tired eyes widened at the sight of the cafe owner she believed she would never see again. Conflicting emotions churned behind her gaze, a mixture of hurt, anger, and the faint stirrings of hope. Yet the heaviness of recent memories lingered as she recalled the day he had demanded she leave, turning a morning coffee into a moment of dehumanizing shame. Though Mr. Lambert's tongue felt thick and unwieldy, he spoke her name gently, voicing a quiet admission that he had wronged her grievously, asking if she might allow him to explain and apologize in full, though he knew he had no right to expect her forgiveness. She regarded him for several beats of silence, her posture stiff with apprehension, and though part of her wanted to walk away without another word, to preserve her dignity by refusing him any path to reconciliation. Something in his eyes suggested that this was not a mere performance for the cameras, that he had come alone, vulnerable, and visibly wrestling with remorse. At last, she led him to a nearby folding chair, the only one unoccupied in a plain waiting area lined with cheap benches, gesturing for him to sit, though she herself remained standing, as though unsure whether this conversation warranted anything resembling comfort or closeness. He recounted, haltingly, the days since Mark Wahlberg had confronted him, describing the mounting protests, the online fury, and the sudden deterioration of his once thriving café. But he also bared a deeper, more personal sense of guilt that had haunted him in sleepless nights and hushed moments of introspection. She listened in grave silence, neither softening nor hardening her expression, until he finally reached the point of unvarnished confession, that he had never truly looked at her as a person, only as a possible inconvenience, a blip in his rigid system of profit-driven rules, a face he hastily labeled undesirable rather than a soul-seeking warmth. The words hung in the stagnant corridor air, raw with unmitigated honesty, and only then did Miss Freeman sink into a nearby chair, her shoulders sagging with the weight of too many similar encounters that had marked her life, instances where her very presence in a public space was questioned or scorned. She cleared her throat, quietly telling him that while his apology was overdue, it mattered that he had taken the time to deliver it in person, without cameras or PR managers orchestrating his every word. Still, she admitted that the pain of what he had done would not vanish with a few remorseful sentences. He cast his gaze downward, nodding as he confessed he understood, and that he wanted to do more than apologize. He wished to invite her back to the cafe as his guest, to ensure she knew that she was welcome, and to bring her into a place where once he had made her feel so unwelcome, a gesture he hoped would symbolize his commitment to change. She eyed him carefully, an unreadable flicker crossing her expression, and informed him she was not certain she wished to return, for the memory of that day remained raw, and trust is not a switch one can simply flip once broken. Nonetheless, he pressed a slip of paper into her hand, explaining that it contained his personal number and that if she ever wished to come in for a coffee, free of charge on her terms, she could call ahead, and he would ensure the staff treated her with genuine respect. She nodded, slipping the note into her pocket, but offered no immediate acceptance, only a polite, if strained, appreciation for his gesture, and the uncertain hush that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of chatter and rustling papers from other rooms. At length, she said quietly that what truly mattered to her was whether this incident would spark a broader change in how he and others regarded people who looked like her, who endured the double burden of both age and race in a world too quick to dismiss them. He swallowed, voicing a vow that he had spent sleepless nights questioning every assumption he once held dear, that he was determined to attend cultural sensitivity training, organized by a local civil rights group, alongside his remaining staff, and that he intended to implement new policies that explicitly welcomed and protected all customers, regardless of status or appearance. Her eyes glistened with a mixture of cynicism and cautious optimism, knowing how often words, no matter how heartfelt, dissolve into empty promises. But she allowed a moment's grace to pass between them, not outright condemning his intentions. He asked for permission to shake her hand, a simple gesture of respect, and for a moment, Miss Freeman paused, studying his outstretched palm, aware this small sign of accord might mark a crucial turning point, but also wary of the profound hurt that still colored her memory. Slowly, she extended her fingers, and their hands met, both trembling slightly, an exchange made heavier by the knowledge that it could not erase the past but might carry a glimmer of hope for the future. As Miss Freeman withdrew her hand, she exhaled, acknowledging that though one conversation could not undo the harm done, it was better than never confronting it at all, and she allowed that maybe, in time, she would test the waters of his café again, if only to see if his professed contrition bore fruit. He thanked her, voice catching in his throat, and with that, their dialogue came to a natural pause, prompting the social worker who had remained nearby to step forward and inform him that the center would soon commence its regular programs. Mr. Lambert stood, shoulders sagging with relief and residual guilt, recognizing the conversation was over for now, yet leaving with a sense of purpose that transcended the fears and doubts that had plagued him since his world came crashing down. Outside, the sky glowered with an impending rainstorm, but he felt oddly uplifted, clutching the doorknob of the center for a moment to steady himself as he exited, taking in the sight of gathering gray clouds that seemed to reflect both the gloom of his mistakes and the possibility of a cleansing downpour. He returned to his café that afternoon, fielding the usual glares of protesters gathered outside, some brandishing signs with bold slogans decrying racism and demanding justice, but for the first time, he mustered the courage to speak to them directly, explaining that he had sought out Miss Freeman in person and was prepared to transform his establishment. At first, they met his words with skepticism, unwilling to be appeased by vague expressions of regret, but when he brought up the training initiatives, the changes to policy, and even recounted his heart-to-heart with Miss Freeman, a few among them paused, intrigued by the details. He invited one of the protest organizers, a tall, sharp-tongued woman who had been among the most vocally critical of him, to step inside and observe the new codes of conduct he had drafted, pinned up next to the menu, proclaiming that every customer, no matter how little they spent or how long they stayed, would be treated with unwavering respect. While her wariness did not fade entirely, she accepted the invitation with guarded curiosity, stepping over the threshold into a space that had become a battleground for moral reckoning, taking note of the quieter ambience, the staff who seemed tense but resolute in trying to uphold a kinder ethos. Mr. Lambert introduced her to his baristas, encouraging them to share how they felt about the changes, and though a few struggled to articulate the shift in climate, others admitted they welcomed the training and the renewed emphasis on empathy, hailing it as a necessary step for their own personal growth. Still, the protest organizer left without outright endorsing the café, mindful that a single afternoon could not prove a lifetime transformation, but she signaled a willingness to suspend the daily pickets if real, transparent progress continued. Over the following weeks, Mr. Lambert directed every resource he had toward rebuilding trust, hosting open community hours, in which neighborhood residents could sit for as long as they pleased, purchasing only a single coffee if that was all they desired, and offering a small courtesy discount to senior citizens to underline his intent to right his wrong. Attendance was sparse at first, with many still shunning the café, but slow trickles of old regulars began returning, emboldened by testimonies from the few curious patrons who ventured in and found a gentler, more introspective owner greeting them. The media, always hungry for stories of redemption, cautiously revisited the café, filming segments that chronicled these changes, even capturing tearful interviews with new patrons praising the shift in attitude and the once stern baristas who now demonstrated genuine kindness. One evening, as an attempt to further express contrition, Mr. Lambert quietly sponsored a local charitable event for elderly assistance programs, donating not just money but also an array of coffee and pastries, with every worker on his staff volunteering their time. Though he kept his name off the main promotional materials to avoid accusations of seeking praise, word spread through the grapevine that the cafe owner who had once callously ejected a helpless woman was now going out of his way to serve the elderly, sowing seeds of reconsideration in people's hearts. No single gesture could heal the wound entirely, and Mr. Lambert recognized this truth, forging ahead with the conviction that only ongoing effort, day by day, could prove his sincerity, a slow, often painful process of earning back the trust he had so casually forfeited. Meanwhile, Ms. Freeman continued attending her craft group at the community center, hearing second-hand accounts of the café's transformation, how it had become almost a different place since that fateful day. But she remained cautious, telling those who nudged her to visit that she preferred to wait until it felt truly safe. Unknown to Mr. Lambert, she sometimes hovered just down the block, observing from afar as customers filed in and out, noting whether the once prevalent tension still lingered in the staff's eyes, or if the lines of protest signs had truly disappeared. Late one afternoon, after a steady drizzle had dampened the sidewalks, Miss Freeman quietly slipped inside, the familiar chime of the door making her stomach twist with unease. But she steeled herself and approached the counter, determined to see whether the atmosphere matched the rumors. A new barista, friendly-eyed and informed of the café's changed policies, greeted her gently, offering a warm smile and asking if she wanted help picking out a pastry for the special senior discount, a question that felt jarring in its kindness. She accepted a small cup of coffee, free of the earlier worry about being forced to leave immediately, and scanned the room, noticing how the staff didn't flinch at her presence, but instead seemed relieved to see an older customer walk in, a subtle sign of the shift in their culture. As she sat in the corner where she had once been so harshly ejected, her heart fluttered with a mix of anxiety and hope, and though she had not announced her visit to Mr. Lambert, it did not take long for him to spot her from his station. Their gazes met across the room, and an unspoken understanding passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement that this was a test of his sincerity and her willingness to heal, a brief nod that contained a quiet gravity neither dared to break with rushed words. Though he yearned to approach to express gratitude for her presence, he let her savor her coffee undisturbed, instructing his staff with a simple glance to avoid hovering or fussing over her, respecting her right to enjoy the space on her own terms. Miss Freeman noticed the difference in the café's ambience, the music playing softly in the background, the subdued chatter of a few patrons, and the gentle hush in which people came and went without being judged for how little or how much they purchased. By the time she finished, she felt her tension slip away, replaced by a cautious relief, and as she stood to leave, she caught Mr. Lambert's eye one more time, offering him a slight nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that seemed to lift an invisible weight from his posture. Over the ensuing weeks, she reappeared sporadically, never making a show of her visits, quietly assessing whether the promised change was real or merely a veneer, gradually noticing the staff's consistent courtesy and the near absence of the old, unspoken fear of undesirable customers. In time, she and Mr. Lambert struck up tentative conversations, always beginning with small talk about how the day had gone, or a mild comment about the freshness of the pastries, but layering in undertones of deeper understanding and mutual respect. Mark Wahlberg, hearing through the grapevine that the café had undergone a remarkable shift, dropped by unannounced one afternoon, accompanied by a small entourage, and found Mr. Lambert not only welcoming but eager to show him the progress. The new policies mounted on a sleek board near the door, and the staff who smiled rather than scowled at unfamiliar faces. After that visit, social media lit up again, but this time with more positive commentary, capturing photographs of Mark shaking hands with the once-maligned cafe owner as Miss Freeman sipped coffee in the background. A poignant image that spoke volumes without a single word. The protest organizer who had been so vocal initially even wrote an update, acknowledging that while she remained cautious about praising a man who had so cruelly dismissed an elderly woman, she also believed in second chances and saw genuine effort at the cafe that merited an open mind. Through baby steps and continual introspection, the cafe re-established itself as part of the community fabric, gradually coaxing back the diverse tapestry of customers who once patronized Lambert's, though now, they found a gentler edge, a lingering humility in the owner's demeanor that undercut his previously rigid stance. The press eventually found another story to chase, but local word of mouth preserved the memory of the day Mark Wahlberg intervened, ensuring the cafe staff remained accountable to a higher standard of inclusivity that hinged not on the drama of a single event but on everyday compassion. On a particularly cold winter morning, Miss Freeman arrived, coat bundled against the chill, and settled into the corner with a warm mug in her trembling hands, content to read a small novel she'd picked up from a local library, without fear of a ticking clock or a potential command to leave. Mr. Lambert, quietly polishing glasses behind the counter, found himself smiling in her direction, a gesture of appreciation that their rapport, once shattered by ignorance and prejudice, had begun to mend through mutual courage, contrition, and honesty. The morning crowd passed by like any other day, but woven into the bustle was an intangible sense of solidarity, customers chatting more openly, some commenting on the improved atmosphere and lingering in conversation rather than rushing off, a testament to the intangible benefits of compassion. In a world quick to devour negativity, the café's transformation offered a small but meaningful reminder that mistakes, however grave, can be confronted and corrected if one is prepared to put pride aside and meet those harmed face to face, bearing genuine remorse. As the final hours before closing slipped by, Miss Freeman finished her book, gently placed it in her bag, and rose from her seat with the confidence of someone who at last felt safe, no longer dreading the humiliating tap on the shoulder or the stinging command to vacate. Mr. Lambert came over, voice hushed, to see if she needed anything else before heading out, and though she declined, she allowed him to walk her to the door, where they paused under the fluorescent glow of the overhead sign, both remembering how, once upon a time, this exit had felt like a forced expulsion. Now, that memory stood in stark contrast to the subtle warmth that emanated from every corner of the café, from the staff's friendly greetings to the posted list of rules that placed empathy above profit, a transformation that took countless small steps but culminated in an unmistakable shift in spirit. He bowed his head slightly in thanks, acknowledging her role in spurring his growth, and she offered a faint, gracious smile, understanding that though the scars of that initial hurt would never vanish, the path toward healing lay in forging a new pattern of mutual respect. Stepping out into the crisp, moonlit air, she felt the city's hum envelop her, but this time, she carried a sense of validation rather than shame, a feeling that dignity had been restored, and that the café which once treated her so callously now stood as a quiet example of how confrontation, apology, and structural changes could foster genuine community. Mark Wahlberg's intervention had not just been a spectacle of celebrity justice but the catalyst for a profound moral reckoning that reverberated through the block, reminding both Lambert staff and patrons alike that every act of inclusion or exclusion defines the soul of a place. The final, reflective hush in the café that night seemed to hold echoes of all that had transpired, the hiss of the espresso machine a gentle counterpoint to the occasional rattle of dishes, each sound signaling a sense of routine restored but forever altered by newfound empathy. Outside, protest signs had long since been removed, replaced by a small chalkboard that read, "All are welcome," and though the words might have seemed corny or performative in another context, in this instance they reflected an honest pledge that the entire neighborhood could trust and rely on. Even as closing time neared, a handful of patrons remained, sipping tea and sharing quiet conversation, proving that the café, once overshadowed by a bitter scandal, had emerged as a place where people genuinely wanted to linger, forging connections unburdened by fear of judgment. And though Mr. Lambert would forever carry the memory of that catastrophic moment when he drove away a gentle soul, it no longer defined him. Rather, it served as a pillar of accountability, a reminder that every interaction offers a choice, to perpetuate indifference or to enact kindness. His once rigid policies now flexed with a spirit of understanding, acknowledging that rules were meant to serve people, not the other way around, and in this slow but seismic shift, the entire establishment found a new identity that resonated far beyond its walls. The next day and every day after, Miss Freeman's seat by the window remained open, and if she chose to occupy it, whenever the winter winds grew too brisk or her feet too weary, the staff would greet her with the same warmth they offered everyone, not out of false sentimentality, but from a genuine sense of shared humanity. And so, in the heart of a hectic city, Lambert's Coffee and Comfort had finally earned its name, joining daily life as a living testament that even a single cup of coffee, offered without prejudice, can become a symbol of redemption and hope for those willing to learn from their mistakes.